You know, we all think about leaving a legacy, about what mark we'll leave on the world. But what if pursuing that legacy, that passion, came with a hidden price tag, a cost you couldn't see until it was way too late? Well, that's exactly the story we're diving into.
So take a look at this. At first glance, it's just a plant, right? A pretty little flower you'd find way up in the mountains of South Africa. But its name, Brunnthaleri, that's not just some random scientific label. Nope, it's a clue. It's an echo of a life totally dedicated to discovery.
So that begs the question, doesn't it? Who was the man behind the name? And how on earth could his greatest achievement also be the very thing that caused his downfall? Let's dig in and uncover the story.
We're talking about a man named Josef Brunnthaler, born way back in 1871 in Vienna. And his story, well, it's about a lot more than just plants. It's really about the relentless, against all odds pursuit of a dream.
But here's the thing, Brunnthaler didn't start out as a scientist, not even close. See, the path his family had laid out for him pointed in a completely different direction. His father was a businessman, and he insisted that Josef follow the family tradition. So by day, he was a banker, a bookkeeper, crunching numbers. But as soon as he was off the clock, his real life began. He was a naturalist at heart, just completely obsessed with studying plants.
I mean, for years, this guy literally lived a double life. He kicks off his banking career in 1887, but just 10 years later, while he's still a full-time banker, mind you, he goes and founds his own scientific institute. The real game changer came in 1904 when his bank went under. Now, for most people, that's a disaster, right? But for Brunnthaler, it was his get-out-of-jail-free card. He grabbed that chance and walked away from the business world forever.
And what's absolutely wild is that he did all this with no formal university training in science. Nothing. Brunnthaler was a true autodidact, a self-taught expert. Everything he knew was built on his own relentless curiosity and just burying himself in study.
So for him, this wasn't just, a simple career change. This was it. This was the moment his life truly began. He was finally free to chase his dream, a dream that was about to take him on the adventure of a lifetime. So, with some backing from the Academy of Sciences and a few private sponsors, he was finally able to organize the one thing he'd always wanted, a major scientific expedition to Africa. Okay, so picture this. The year is 1909. After all those years of dreaming from behind a desk in Vienna, Josef Brunnthaler is finally on a ship, setting sail for a whole new continent.
And listen, this was no weekend getaway. We're talking about an epic undertaking. His journey took him from what was then German East Africa, through grueling treks in the Usambra Mountains, down to Mozambique and the incredible Victoria Falls, and finally to the botanical paradise of Cape Town, South Africa.
The guy's dedication was just unreal. Early on in the trip, he actually falls and breaks a rib. But did that stop him? No way. He just packed up his gear and kept right on going, refusing to let anything get in the way of his research. When he got to South Africa's Great Karoo Desert, he was completely captivated. He wrote about his awe at finding what he called the living stones, these amazing succulent plants that perfectly mimic the rocks around them. You can just feel the excitement jumping off the page in his words.
And this is where it all comes full circle. High in the mountains near a place called Giant's Castle, at an altitude of 2,300 meters, he collected a specimen of an unknown plant. This was it, the very plant from the beginning of our story.
By any measure, the expedition was a massive success. I mean, just stop and think about the logistics here in the early 1900s. He managed to send over 300 living plants all the way back to Vienna. And they survived, almost without exception. He had successfully transported a living piece of Africa all the way home.
So, he returns to Vienna a hero, a celebrated scientist who had fulfilled his life's dream. But that dream, and all the work it required, carried a terrible, unseen price.
The very methods that made his work so successful were slowly and very silently turning against him.
It all happened so fast. Just 2 years after his triumphant return, his health began to fail, dramatically. By 1912, he was forced to give up most of his work, and in 1914, Josef Brunnthaler was dead. He was only 42 years old.
So what happened? How could a guy tough enough to trek through Africa with a broken rib decline so rapidly? Well, the answer was hiding in his tools of the trade.
The answer was formaldehyde. To preserve the thousands of specimens he collected, Brunnthaler was constantly handling this chemical. It was an incredibly effective preservative, but as we now know all too well, it's also a slow, insidious poison.
And here is the most heartbreaking irony of all. As his own health was collapsing, Brunnthaler, the scientist, began to understand what was happening. In his final years, he actually published papers with titles like The Hygienic Dangers of Formaldehyde and On the Toxic Effects of Formaldehyde. He was a scientist to the very end, documenting the dangers of the poison that was taking his own life.
His premature death was a huge loss to science. He left behind a mountain of unfinished work, including the final analysis of his great African expedition. We'll just never know what other discoveries he still had left to share.
But his legacy wasn't lost. A colleague of his, Alwyn Berger, named that little plant he discovered in the mountains of South Africa after him, the Elosperma brunthalerae. So his passion for discovery, preserved in those old specimens, also gets to live on in this beautiful, thriving plant.
Josef Brunnthaler's story really makes you wonder, doesn't it? He achieved his life's dream and left a permanent mark on science, but he paid for it with his life. It leaves us with a final question. What is the true measure of a legacy?